Hello? Oh, here, please. Huh?
Try it again.
Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Is it because the stitch cam isn't live potentially? Oh, that's better? Okay. Sound check, RK. Okay, great. That's always a little bit nerve-wracking when something doesn't work quite right off the bat, but I'm glad you guys can hear me okay. So, like I was saying, Callista's behind the camera today. If you have any questions, you can still just add it in the chat. We'll make sure to address as many of them as possible. It's going to be a little bit more casual today. So, as usual, if you have some coffee or tea or even like a stitching project you want to work on while we kind of have a chit chat, please do so. Get comfortable, and I think we can pretty much get started here. Uh, like I mentioned before, since it's the first episode of Stitching with Stephanie, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So at Wonderful, I'm actually in the events and sponsorships department. It's not really as much in education and stuff, although we do Threaducation events with like our Threaducators. Stitching really came to me as more of a hobby than part of my everyday job here at Wonderful. But since it's become a passion of mine, I'm really glad I'm able to share some of my tips and tricks I've learned over the years with some of you. So, how I started with kind of sewing and stitching was my mother actually put me in sewing lessons when I was a teenager at just a local sewing teacher's house in Calgary. And I went every Tuesday for about 4 years. But I can't say that my skills really improved a huge amount. It was a lot of basic, very basic garment construction, some doll figures, and then I also made my first quilt, which was just a very simple rag quilt that I gifted my grandfather. And so I really enjoyed my time when I was going to sewing lessons. But then as I got into high school and university, I actually stopped a lot of my creative extracurriculars, especially as university can kind of get a little bit stressful sometimes. So I kind of just had my head down and I was studying. And in my last year, I realized that I lost a really valuable hobby, which was creating and making. And so I took Art 203, which is an art class for students that are not in the art faculty. So I was in there with a bunch of first year students all making art together, and that really reignited, I think, my inner serial hobbyist and making things. So right out of university then, my mother Fiona and my father Andrew, which some of you may know, they said, come to Wonderful, and you can just work half the day and then spend the other half of the day applying to jobs and see where you get. And I'm not sure if it was planned or not, but over time I was spending less time applying for jobs and more time doing some ad hoc things around Wonderful. And then as time went on, I just became a full-time employee at Wonderful. So this is really how I kind of got started at working here. And when you're seeing all the threads and sewing and quilting and inspiration every day, there's really no escape in terms of dipping your toes into a little bit of stitching here or sewing there. So primarily that's how it all began. Um, my first Oh, I should add too that at the office here, for a few years before COVID, we had stitching every Wednesday with a group of ladies. Some of our staff would stay after hours and we'd all sew and stitch together. I was definitely the most green out of everyone. So they would teach me how to stitch or teach me how to sew, what certain terminologies meant from here and there. And my first project was Sue Spargo needle case. And that's where I learned how to do hand stitching. And I really owe it to this book. I'm not sure if any of you have seen it before, but it's Creative Stitching by Sue Spargo. And this is my holy grail. I was going to say was, but it's not, because I still use it all the time. This is how I learned how to hand stitch. And her needle book was also a bunch of these little circles, kind of what she's very known for. And what I would do is I would flip through the book and find something that looked interesting. For example, the Italian border stitch, something like that. I've never done it before, but I would just try. And then that's how I created my first project. And since then, I've stitched on quite a few different fabrics and mediums. And I must say, I think wool probably still speaks to my heart the most, just because that's what I learned on and became quite familiar with. So I wanted to show you some of the projects I've done from then on. And this is definitely not all of it. And I still don't get a ton of time to work on wool projects as much as I would like. But this was a pin cushion that I bought at a show. Oh, right here. The camera's quite zoomed in, so hopefully you guys can see some detail. There's actually supposed to be a cactus sticking straight out the top of this, but again, the stitches in the instruction were actually quite simple. We're looking at back stitches, chain stitches, things like that. But again, I'd cut out the wool applique shape, and I'd flip through that book, find a stitch that I thought kind of looked interesting that I wanted to try, and I would just try it. So this is just chain stitches going in different directions. This is a really simple back stitch. Let me put that back down. It's probably easier to see. This is just a back stitch that I did, and you just weave thread under and over, or not over, but kind of under, back and forth like this in a wave, all the way to the end, and then you wave it back under. And it creates some really cool designs. And same with this. This is like a chain stitch, but super, super wide. And I'd just try all these different stitches and make my first project. And I think it's all about just putting thread through the needle and testing it out and see what you think. I think sometimes it's easy to be a little bit intimidated when you first look at something like this. If I looked at this project initially, I probably wouldn't have chosen to begin with it, but it just started with following a pretty basic pattern and adjusting some of the stitches to the ones that I wanted to try. And another one too is we do make and takes at some shows. So this was a make and take that I did at Pour l'Amour du Fil, which is a show in Nantes in France. And so this is just a very basic pin cushion. But again, it's just to have people adjust and play with their stitches and see what kind of variety they can have. For example, I think most people know how to do a blanket stitch, and this is just two blanket stitches that are facing each other. But it gives a really nice dimension instead of just outlining something like this. This is also a blanket stitch, but I just used it to seal the edges of my pin cushion. You can see right there. But in a decorative sense, I tried kind of making them face each other. It made a really cool kind of zippered effect. And one thing that I tried on this pin cushion that I didn't try before was on the back here. I had two scrap pieces of wool. Neither was big enough to cover the whole back. So what I did was I pieced it together on the sewing machine, and there was a seam running down the middle. But to cover it, I put a fly stitch, and then I just added some French knots on either side to kind of make a flower vine kind of look. And you wouldn't even be able to tell that it's pieced. But it is actually two separate pieces of fabric that I put together from my scraps. And I just covered up the seam, kind of like crazy quilting if you've ever done some decorative stitches over the seams. I just did it in a handwork type application. So that brings me to some current projects that we're working on. The first one we've shown in, I think, one of our hand stitching videos before. And this is a large quilt. I think it's about 12 blocks that Calista and I are actually working on. The pattern is by a designer at Midway Wool. Her name is Rochelle, and she does amazing work. Very, very detailed. Takes a lot of time. But we just take some of this some of these threads on the road and we just chip away at it little by little. I see a question right here. Close to showing me. Michelle says, what thread were you using? So I use a lot of different types of thread. Primarily it's eleganza. So I'm just going to move this to the side. We have eleganza in 3 different weights. This is an 8 weight. And I have 5 weight and 3 weight on the shelf in a purple. I'm just showing Calista where it might be. Down and to the right. So Calista's gonna find some different weights of thread that I can show you. But I would say most commonly I'm using an 8 weight thread right here. You might also see it in this form. This is also 8 weight thread. So for some of you that are less familiar with thread weight, the lower the number, the thicker the thread. The higher the number, the thinner the thread. I think popularity-wise, 12 weight and 8 weight are more commonly used than 5 and 3. So I'll just pull out a strand right here. This is an 8 weight, and I'm just going to grab some fabric so you can see the thickness of this thread. So this is an 8 weight thread right here. And this would be the same thickness that comes from the ball. When you see the 2 different spools, it's just simply different colorways. It's the exact same thread. So you can see that right there. And eleganza is a pearl cotton. So what that means is the thread is actually round in shape. So when you're doing certain decorative stitches, it's going to have a little bit more dimension and volume to the stitch because it's round. The difference between a pearl cotton and a floss is the pearl cotton can't be separated like floss can be. So floss, you have 6 strands and you can pull apart as many as you want to get the volume or thickness that you desire in your stitching. Since you can't do that with the pearl cotton, that's why you might be moving up in thread weight. So this is a number 5 right here, and then a number 3. So I'm just going to hold them up all really close. So hopefully, oops, you can see there. Maybe it's easier if I pull one strand out. Give me 1 second here. All right. So this is a 5 weight thread. And I'll show you what it looks stitched out to. So again, this is our 8 weight, our 5 weight, and then 3 weight is the chunkiest that we have. So this is 3 weight. And so although it might be a little bit harder to tell on the camera, 3 weight is very chunky to the point where we've had people actually crochet with this weight before. This is 5 weight. 5 weight is a personal favorite weight of mine because it just gives so much volume, really a lot of definition when you're doing things like back stitch, stem stitch, bullion knots. You can still see the individual strand very clearly. I love 5 weight. And then again, this is 8 weight, so you can tell it's a little bit finer compared to the 5 and the 3. And when you're moving around in different weights as well, something important to consider is your needle size. Yeah, so Michelle, you're asking the perfect questions. So for the ones that we're using here, it's a milliner's. So something handy about if you're ever choosing this type of spool that I was holding earlier, these 3, is that the spool color matches the needle case color. So for example, our 8 weight thread would be for this milliner's number 3, which is the green spool. For the 5 weight thread, which is this one right here, it would match the milliner's 1, which is the purple one right here. And then last but not least, we have the 3 weight thread, which would match the milliner's 15 right there. And we also have the corresponding sizes in chenilles too. So a common question that we get is, when would you use a milliner's and when would you use a chenille? I'm just going to grab the biggest needle we have here so you can see a little bit more clearly. This is the milliner's number 15 that I got. I'm just going to move some things out of the way. So a milliner's needle, as you can see, is quite long. And the reason why it's quite long is so you can do more decorative stitching with the milliner's needle, especially in terms of using it for bullion knots and French knots. Because as you can see, a milliner's needle is virtually the same size from the top to the bottom in diameter, minus the tip. So this makes it very easy for you to wrap stitches onto the needle and then pull it through without straining your hand too much. The alternative needle for hand embroidery that's popular would be a chenille needle. And I have one right here as well. So this is a chenille needle. I think many people are familiar with this needle. And so it's much shorter than the milliner's needle that I was holding up earlier. And it also has a very large eye. It has a larger eye here. But what comes with the larger eye is that the needle diameter and width actually increases as you go up the shaft of the needle. So if you are doing things like French knots or bullion knots, it'll be a lot harder to pull your needle through if you have some tightly wrapped stitches around this part of your needle, and you'll end up straining your hand more. Another benefit of a milliner's needle when you're doing those stitches is you have a lot more room to play with when you're wrapping stitches. This is going to be a lot shorter, so I would typically reserve chenille needles for when I'm doing things like blanket stitching, chain stitching, whip stitching, something that's a little bit smaller, quicker, and that you don't need to load either a lot of fabric onto the needle or you don't need to load a lot of wraps onto the needle itself. So those are the main needles that I use for hand embroidery. And then I'll use usually a short darner or a small needle if I'm doing wool applique or applique with like standard quilting cotton. So I hope that kind of answers your question. There is another thread I wanted to bring into the picture to show you guys, and I also use this quite a lot in my stitching. It's called Glamour, which is right here, and Dazzle, which is right here. So the difference between Glamour and Dazzle is Glamour is a 12 weight thread and Dazzle is an 8 weight thread. So again, the higher the number, the thinner the thread. So let me just pull out Glamour for you to see. This is the 12 weight thread right here. And then right here is the 8 weight thread in Dazzle. So you can see there's actually quite a substantial difference in terms of like thickness. And this will also affect your needle choices, like how I mentioned earlier. Glamour and Dazzle are both rayon threads with a strand of metallic that goes through it. So it adds a really nice sparkle into your wool work. And you also have a little bit more freedom, I find, to add these types of rayon threads to your embroidery because you know you're not going to be putting it in a space where there's going to be a lot of abrasion. It's generally quite protected, or it's mostly for viewing and not for using. So Dazzle and Glamour are definitely favorites of mine. As you can see here, aside from the metallic, the rayon itself has a really beautiful high luster and high sheen. So when you stitch out with it, it's really eye-catching. So I typically reserve it for moments where I want something to pop. So back to this sample right here. The birds I did right here with a thread called Starry Night Dazzle. So that's that 8-weight rayon with one strand of metallic. And the Starry Night Dazzle is a collection we did with a designer called Kim Rado. And she actually has a variegation in this dazzle. So you get a little bit more dimension when you stitch out with it. And I like to add it here and there. You'll notice the seeds of the strawberry pop out at you a little bit more, and that's also not just yellow thread. This is also Dazzle in yellow. So in person, it shimmers in the light, like the dress or shirt of this gnome too. This is also Dazzle, and it just really adds a nice sparkle. I also did it with the flowers. So instead of using a flat color like a white cotton, which would still look nice, I think I just wanted a little bit more pizzazz. So that's why I went with Dazzle flowers right here. And you can kind of see the comparison. The rest of these areas right here is just cotton. And right here, this is all cotton. The bullion knots, the scroll stitches, this is all cotton thread. There is one more thread I forgot to mention, and it's called Razzle. It's the sister to Dazzle. So if you imagine Dazzle without the metallic that's running through it, that is Razzle. And so I used Razzle to do the little stems, the middle part of these leaves. And again, you can tell it's not just the color because this is also light colored. The stems really reflect light very well. I also have like 3 studio lights shining down. So I think the Dazzle is doing an especially good job showing up under the camera. So very, very nice. And I'm going to mention right now too is I oftentimes get the question of whether or not I knot my thread. And I think everyone's been taught differently or how they picked up hand embroidery. I think personally, because it was half self-taught, half I learned from some really gifted hand stitchers that we have in the office. It's quite open and loose. I think whatever feels comfortable for you is what you should go with. Personally, I knot my thread in the back. So if I flip over my work really quickly, it's not the most clean. I need to do some thread trimming, so please don't judge me. But you can see right here, I have little knots for where I begin thread. And that's because sometimes I'll start some decorative stitches in the middle of nowhere. So I don't feel like it's secure enough for me to just run it underneath my existing stitches. I'll actually add a little bit of a knot. And as well, because a lot of our samples are going on the show and people touch them and things like that, I like to add extra security as insurance for the stitches. So everything's all locked into place. I think another really nice aspect of working on wool is even if you do have a lot of knots, like how I did in the back of my strawberry gnome, you can't actually see the texture of the knots come through. I think if you're working on thinner fabric, then either not making knots or minimizing where you're using knots might be a little bit more important so you're not getting as many lumps and bumps. But as for my wool embroidery, I typically always put a little knot in the back before I begin. So the next one I think some of you might be familiar with. It is the bird BOM. I think many of you have seen the digital version of it, or if some of you have this kit at home, you have a picture of it. But I thought it'd be really nice for you guys to actually see it on camera, and maybe some of the stitches will show through differently. And so for those of you that are unaware, we are having our first wool block of the month this year. We did have a block of the month last year that was foundation paper piecing. And this year we're comboing our foundation paper piece blocks with a wool applique and wool hand embroidery set. And we've so far released 2 blocks, and the third one will be coming out really soon. and it's really fun. The way that this was designed was for at least the first few birds to be quite simple and pretty straightforward to do, especially for those of you that are maybe a little bit newer to hand embroidery. And then as the months go on, I'm going to be adding in a little bit of difficulty, still nothing too much, but I'm just going to show what kind of thought process went into designing the stitches for this bird. So it includes a lot of the basic stitches that you'll see in many other embroidery patterns. So that includes fly stitches, French knots, stem stitches, and chain stitches. I think the one I want to kind of highlight that's special on this one is the chain stitch. So what I did here was I actually went around the outside of my applique. So if I kind of open it up, you can see that it's not on top of my wool. It's actually just around the wool. And this is one look I kind of went with, and I thought it looked nice. But as I was doing a little bit more hand stitching, I actually started doing my chain stitches half on the wool, half off the wool, or half on the wool applique and then half on the background, if that kind of makes sense. And that actually adds a pretty different look to the hand embroidery as well. So even with the same stitch, it can look really different, because with the chain stitch around the outside here, you can pretty visibly tell it's flat, it's laying flat. But when you have it on the wool applique and on the background, when you're doing your chain stitch, it actually is on a bit of a slope. So your chain stitches will look a little bit different compared to this. And this again is all eleganza 8 weight. And right here, I just added some accents onto the wood with Alana, which is our wool thread. Right here is the hummingbird. So this is the most recent, excuse me, this is our most recent block of the month. And it's also pretty simple. We did more blanket stitching here. Here we are doing couching for the block of the month for the first time. How I like to do my couching is I'll come up with the thread that needs to be couched down first, and I'll, depending on the length and if there's curves, I might adjust it differently. But since this is just a straight line, I'll bring the thread up and actually just poke it back down and keep a bit of tension on it as I do the couching stitch over each one. And I think the little special highlight I have on this guy was the tassel. I love making little tassels with eleganza. On this pin cushion I was showing earlier, this also has tassels with eleganza. If you ever have colors of thread or floss or something and you don't know what to do with it, you can always make some cute little tassels. It's really simple and it doesn't actually take too much thread. So that's a little cute thing there. So I think that's what I wanted to show for the block of the month before I hop into the next little section and do some real hand stitching and live hand stitching with you guys. So thank you so much for all the kind words. Is there any questions, Callista, or do you feel like there's anything that I missed that you want me to cover? We're good? Okay, so if we can just switch cameras really quick. Okay, the next thing, I know you've probably heard about it, is our, oh, thank you. I miss being in Paducah too. I really wanted to go this year. Like I mentioned, we have a show in France, and that one actually just ended last weekend. So Callista and I flew back on Monday. So that's why we're not in Paducah. Otherwise, I'd love to be in Paducah too. It's such a great show. But I'm happy to be here too, doing my first episode of Stitching with Stephanie. So, I was going to mention, many of you have probably heard about this product, which is the Rinse Away Design Sheet. This is still relatively new on the market. We've only brought it to a few shows so far, and it sells out quite quickly. Some of you may have used a similar product before, but the essence of it is that you can print on it or you can draw on it, and it's kind of like a sticker that you can wash away. The main difference here is when we were prototyping this product, we were testing it for I think 16 or 18 months to make sure we could make something that was thin enough that it'd wash away easily and also sticky enough, but not so sticky that it would affect your stitching or your needle. So your needle glides extremely well through this rinse away design sheet. So, oh, is everything okay? We're okay? Okay, internet's back on. So I have some samples kind of to show you the different stages because we do have a video, but I think seeing it live is always a little bit more fun. All I've done here is print on one sheet. So it comes blank, and I just printed 4 flower bouquets that I designed for a class. On the back, you can see that there's a grid if you need to measure any of your outlines. So I'll just hold it up a little bit closer so you can see. This is what it looks like printed out. And if Calista, you want to switch the angle really quickly, I want to show you something pretty cool.
I'm having internet issues. Can you switch it?
Yes, so let me see if I can.
Put this a little layer on the top.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay, there we go. I'm just gonna grab a pack of thread right here, spaghetti. So you can see the lettering is pretty bold right there. And I don't have any light box. You can actually put the rinse away design sheet on top of text or a pattern, and you're going to be able to actually trace it out pretty clearly even without a light box, which I think is really awesome. I know not everyone has it. I've definitely held a paper up to a computer screen before too to try and trace it. So that's why it was really important for us that you can still see through it. And you can still see the grid. You can still see any outlines that you might want to trace. So we can go back to regular view. There we go. So, and I wanted to show a little bit of a mistake too, just to show that not everything's perfect. We printed on the wrong side in the first copy, and then we just reprinted it on the right side. So even if you print on the wrong side, it's not the end of the world. It happens. And it happens to us too sometimes. But since I have this one right here, I'm just going to flip it around and follow the grid line. I'm just using a pair of regular scissors right here. Okay. And the grid is split into 1/2-inch squares. So this is my cutout of the flower bouquet. And what I'm going to do is just grab some stitching fabric like so. I'm just going to flip it back to this camera view right here. So like that. And show you how I peel this guy off. So sometimes it's hard to grab the corner. This one isn't too difficult. Like with my finger, the grip of my fingerprint, it can actually just kind of like lift the corner like that. If you are having any issues, you can either grab the butt end of your needle and try to like pull the sticker back a little bit like this, or you can just try to fold the paper, bend the paper back, and the sticker might lift itself. So since I'm able to just pick it up with my finger like so, you just peel it off like this. And this is not permanent, it is repositionable, so if you do put it in the wrong spot the first time, it's okay. You can see right here that it's actually really visible where you want to stitch. And in our YouTube video where we're talking more about it, the rinse away design sheet, we put it on pattern fabric, dark fabric, all different sorts of stuff so you can see how it shows. So I'm just going to try to put it as center as I can right there. And then I can pretty much begin stitching right away. And right before I start here, I'm just going to hold up this. So oops. Can we switch to the other camera? There we go. Okay. So I was very, very excited about this product because, again, I've used kind of similar ones before, but they tend to gum up your needle a little bit, or it's not the easiest to wash away. And as some of you probably know, there's a lot of really cool designs out there, but they're just fully digital. So you either have to trace it with some sort of marking pen, like a friction pen or chalk or something of that means onto your fabric, and then you stitch on what you trace on. And one major downside I personally found to it is you lose a lot of detail and accuracy when you're just trying to like trace the lines with a chalk pen or a friction pen, especially because fabric has, you know, movement to it. So if your line stretches the fabric and then the fabric returns back to its original spot, it's not the same shape anymore. Whereas this can also help stabilize the fabric a little bit at the same time, so it's not stretching in different directions. So I'll show you some examples of where I used the rinse away design sheet. And this next set, I love it so much. I got it off of Etsy from a designer, a Canadian designer, and her company name is Hook Line and Tinker. And so you can see right here, I'm just going to hold up a few different samples. She had a series of kind of Nordic inspired designs, like so. And so this would be quite difficult to trace out and stitch accurately. I think especially with the shape of these, it depends quite a lot on its uniformity, where the curves are going, and the stitches itself are pretty dense in some areas, like here and right here on the leaves. So I was able to still follow that really accurately because I was using the rinse away design sheet. And this is with a 12 weight thread, so it's a little bit more finely detailed. And this one I really just did for fun because I love Starry Night Dazzle. That's the one I was talking about that has a variegation to it. And all I did was I went on Pinterest and I just Pinterested snowflakes or snowflake outlines. I printed it onto the rinse away design sheet. I found some dark fabric and I just did some stitching and followed the lines as best as I can. Because can you imagine having to trace this out with a chalk pen? That would be not very fun. So this is just another really fun project, and I don't have it completed yet, but you could frame it, you can make it, you can put these into little corners of a table mat or something. But again, this is just to show the detail that you can get into, which would be a lot harder to achieve if you didn't have something like the rinse away design sheet. Calista just dropped off a Starry Night Dazzle, so I'll just hold it up so you guys can see the variegation and the metallic. I really love Starry Night Dazzle. It's really nice to use and it glides through fabric and wool beautifully. And then with the testing of the rinse away design sheet, of course, we also had to test out different needle sizes and different thread weights. So in these next two samples was also the rinse away design sheet, but using a number 5 weight thread. So you can see right here how chunky the stitches are. That's the stem stitch. This is what I mean by using a number 5, you'll get a lot more definition on each individual strand, especially right here you can see in the stem stitch. I think actually this tree right here I used a number 8, so you can compare side by side the number 8, which are these little red trees in the center, and then number 5, which is all this white thread underneath. And again, this is 8 weight Dazzle with 5 weight Eleganza. And I would say the 8 weight Dazzle does look a little bit thicker because the twist is a little bit looser. So even though it is an 8 weight, it can appear to be a little bit thicker than the 8 weight Eleganza. So that is the ones that I've done. And so I wanted to do a little bit of stitching with you guys. So I shall start here. We want to just switch the camera over. When we came back from France, the make and take that we had there was actually this flower bouquet. So people could try the product. And so I already have completed a few different stages. This is the one with just the sticker. This is the one that is partially done. And this is the one that I'm going to complete right now before we wash it out. So I have all my French knots done here. I have some bullion knots here, lazy daisies here. So, and I have back stitches and stem stitches for the stem of the flowers. Where I like to start, and I think for lazy daisies and chain stitches, people go in all sorts of different directions when it comes to stitching. Some people like to stitch downwards. Some people like to go left to right or right to left. When I do my lazy daisies, I personally like working kind of upwards. So I'll start from the base here of my petal. A common question I also get is how much thread do you grab when you're doing hand embroidery? I would typically not grab anything longer than a thread length between my elbow to my shoulder. I would not go any longer than that. I know threading your needle is not the most fun thing in the world, but you'll actually have a lot more troubles if you have a twisted thread like a pearl cotton and you're using too much thread. It's a lot more common to get knots, and then once you get a knot, sometimes you have to cut off more than what you bargained for, and then you end up having two halves that are shorter or you might have to take out some of your work. So there's one petal right there. I like to make sure I'm not pulling too tight when I'm doing my lazy daisies. Do you always finish the edges? Is that a serger or handwork? So because this was going to a show and it was getting passed around quite a lot, we decided to serge the edges of this fabric. So I have this one that I stuck earlier, and we tried to cut on the grain as much as we could, but even so, you still get a lot of these types of wispies that come off the fabric. And then over time, it just looks like a bunch of tangled mess coming off. So that's why we serge the fabric. I don't always serge the fabric. Actually, I typically don't if I'm the only one handling it, but we serged it just because of the number of people touching it. I thought this was actually a really great idea because we're able to use our 12 weight thread, and this was spaghetti, our 12 weight cotton thread in different colors to serge. It actually adds a really nice finish to the project. So for example, if you're just going to be making a tea mat, for example, and you just wanted to embroider in some corners or nothing too crazy, you can always just put fabric of the same kind in the back, put it right on top, serge all the edges, and then you can be done with. And so you don't have to think about, oh, I always have to bind this or I have to find a way to finish it. I think sergers are pretty underutilized. And many people have them more for utility purposes like garment making and stuff. But there's actually a lot of fun things you can do on the serger. This is just an example of us using 12 weight, but we use all the threads that I was holding up earlier. Eleganza, number 8, number 3, Dazzle, like all these threads we put through the serger to get really fun and different results. If you want to see more of that, I can definitely show more serging samples in the future. But yeah, this is all done just with decorative serging. And I would definitely implore you guys to look through the manual of your serger, because you can have like a narrow cover stitch, wide, you can do chain stitch on your serger, and some of it actually imitates handwork pretty closely. So even if you're doing like a pillow, you can serge on your pillow too, and that makes a really great look. So yeah, so that's why these ones are finished. Now, back to this. So I was just saying, when you're doing a lazy daisy, a key point is to make sure you're not pulling them too tight. And when I first started, before I had the actual stencil for me to follow, I think what can also happen is your petals can lean a certain direction instead of them all fanning out equally. A way that I like to keep them pretty equal in terms of how they fan out, and I'll just show you in a second here. So I just tack it down. So let's say I don't have the rest of this stencil for me to follow, but I know where my next petal will start. So for example, it'll start right here. I sometimes will put my needle to measure half of the center point, which I know is a circle. Because if it's anything like this, or if it's like off center at all in the wrong direction, then my petal will also be off center. So I'll put my needle in the middle, and I know it goes this direction, so I'll push it back in through here and come back out through the top, and see how it's still in the middle right there. Here, there you go. You can kind of see how it's in the middle. And that really helps me center my my petals or my circles. Sometimes when I'm like stitching inside a circle, you want all your blanket stitches to go in the same direction, or you want all your fly stitches to be the same direction so they're not all in different tilts and angles. I'll use my needle actually to measure a lot of the time. I might go send Calista on a mission after I finish doing my lazy daisies around this flower and have her actually run this under some water while I show you guys, talk about it. Shouldn't take too long. Another pointer that I have, and this is probably my favorite pointer that I've picked up from some of the ladies at our office, is when I was making my needle case, I was struggling with the French knot, and I think French knot appears easy because it's just a tiny little embellishment. It's not super crazy. But as I've taught people how to do some hand embroidery, French knots can be a little bit elusive, especially because if you twist it the wrong way, then you end up just undoing your French knot and you end up with just like a little seed stitch. So I'm not going to do a French knot right now, but I can kind of show you what I mean. So I'll hold my flower the right way so you can see. So how I like to do a French knot is with my left hand, I'll hold the thread in this direction. Hopefully you guys can see the yellow thread right there. And I'll put my needle parallel to the thread above it, wrap once, twice, sometimes people go 3 times, and then I'll put it actually right next to where I came up, not the exact same spot, and I'll go down. Where I think some people get mixed up is instead of wrapping the needle like this, like how I showed you, they might go in the same direction. So I've seen a lot of this, like that. So you can imagine if you're wrapping the needle pointing like this, and then you go straight down, you're just going to undo the spiral because you're just twisting the thread essentially. So it's important that your needle is pointing in the opposite direction from where your thread is coming out from in order to create that little French knot like that. And if you want your French knots a little bit more consistent, then make sure you're keeping tension on your working thread, because if it's a little bit loose, then you're just going to get a lot of different sized French knots, which is also fine if that's what you're going for. But that's just a little note or a little hint to remember. So let's see. Do we have any questions? Do you prefer a hoop or no hoop? So I personally, I think because I started on wool and I never hooped, that I still actually have a hard time working with a hoop now. I prefer working on usually like thicker fabrics. I would consider this a bit of a thicker fabric. It's definitely not like a quilting cotton. This is, excuse me, this is just like standard stitching fabric. And I don't hoop this because it's a little bit thicker. And then I have it stabilized again with the rinse away design sheet. With these ones here, I did hoop it. I took it out of the hoop sometimes too, though, because with my lazy daisies, like how I'm showing you, I do an up down stitch in one go. And so that's a lot harder to do on the hoop. So for example, oops, there we go. For example, I'll bring my needle down and then I'll bring it back up right here. And so like I'm bending the fabric in order for me to make this stitch, and I'm able to kind of make a little bit of a shortcut because I'm not using a hoop. If I was using a hoop, I would have to stab the needle through all the way and then bring it up all the way. So it's a little bit harder to do some like shortcuts, I guess you can say, with stitching. So I'll show you what this would look like if I was using it with a hoop. I'd bring the thread up, then I bring it down, and then before I pull all this thread through, I would have to come back up like so, making sure I'm catching this thread like this. And then I do my final stitch to tack it down. And so that's why I don't personally use a hoop. I think there's some circumstances that like a hoop is definitely very favorable. A hoop is also probably more convenient if you're making French knots, just because you're not putting your needle straight onto the table, for example. But I do want to show you the helpful tip that I learned about how to make French knots. So let me just see if let me finish off this flower. I just have a few more lazy daisies left. And I really want to show you because I think it would be helpful for anyone out there that struggles with making French knots. And at the same time, I'll show you another stitch called a colonial knot, which is pretty similar to the French knot. You can see right here, I'm again measuring with the center of my flower just to make sure my petals are all going outwards in the same direction. I will say, no matter what stabilizer you are using, if it's a wash away, you do want to just maybe rub your fingers in a little bit in areas where there's denser stitching, just to make sure everything gets washed out. But this one disappears pretty instantly. So that is another tip. If you're in a humid location, make sure you're storing your projects away in a bag if you're not stitching with it, just so not too much humidity gets on it. And I'm just using a variegated eleganza thread. The nice thing about eleganza too is the variegation is very short. So you get a lot of color change in a short amount of stitching, which is how like all these little blue flowers turned out so nice and how these little pink ones turned out so nice. Okay, Calista, I got one more lazy daisy and then I'm gonna send you out on a mission. And I appreciate everyone's patience while you watch me stitch. Okay, there we go. And like I said, I will show you the back of my work. It looks like this. You can see some knots here, so I'll probably trim some of these threads off later. I'm just going to put a little knot by going underneath one of these stitches So you can see a loop, and then I bring my needle through that loop. And I just make sure there's a small little knot. I feel pretty confident that that will stay. And then I just trim. And I think Krista will be back in less than a minute. So here she is. I hope everyone's having a good time so far. I know it's pretty casual, but I appreciate that you guys have stuck around for about an hour now. This is also what I would recommend. I always have some scrap fabric that if I'm learning a new stitch, I'll practice on. Oh, I guess while Callista's doing some washing, I'm going to show you guys how I do the French knot trick. So let me just get some thread. For any of you that use eleganza, sometimes it can be a little bit confusing because if you look in down the middle, there is the loose thread, and some people confuse that for being the end of the thread, but this is actually not what you want to pull. You can just kind of stuff that back inside. If you're grabbing a new ball of eleganza, let me just open one, you will see a little loose end on the side, and that's what you want to take. So I'm just going to take some black or some blue right here. Get a needle. And right here I'm using the milliner's needle that I was showing you guys earlier. Thread it up. Okay. So let's see if I can switch this. Oh, I didn't even get started on my French knot, and Callista's back.
Oh, sorry, I tried to draw it, so it's a little wrinkly.
It's a little wrinkly. It's a little wrinkly because Callista tried to dry it. So the color might look a little bit different, but I'm just going to switch the camera. It's also a little wet, so the colors look different. But all the thread is gone, or all the rinse away design sheet is gone. There is no remnants of it whatsoever. It hasn't distorted any of my lazy daisies. All my French knots just look the same level of tightness. My bullion knots haven't. Hi, Celine. Bonjour. None of these have come undone or become distorted. The back looks the same. Nothing has become undone. So once this dries, I think maybe we'll post something on Instagram to kind of show you guys the 3 stages of these flowers and how it became before and after right here. Once it's a little drier, the colors will be a little bit more bright, but Callista, I think, was maybe gone for 1 minute, maybe less, maybe just a little bit over 1 minute. So it washes away really quickly. You don't need to use hot water. Room temp water under the tap is perfectly fine. And for my last tip of the day is how to do that French knot. So let me just grab some fabric right here. So I'm just going to do this off to the side right here on the one that I stuck the rinse away design sheet onto. So I'm just going to switch over. Oh, I need assistance from Krista. Okay. So I'll grab a pin cushion like this. At home, I use my needle case because it's also just wool, something that you can puncture pretty easily. And so when I'm doing a French knot, I'll come up wherever I want my French knot to be, like so. I'll put it on my pin cushion. I'll do the grab with my left hand, right hand on top, 1, 2, next to where I came up, and you go straight down. And this is where the pin cushion is really helpful because you wouldn't be able to do this on the table. So I've just stabbed the pin cushion. So that really helps stabilize my needle. The key point when you're finishing off your French knot is making sure that you have some tautness on the knot itself. Otherwise it becomes really loosey-goosey. So I'll usually just hold this down with my thumb so it won't loosen. And then when I pull the needle up, it's already ready to be pulled through. And there you go. You get a really nice French knot. It helps a bit with consistency. you get a bit of a rhythm for it when you have like a pin cushion underneath. So I just come up, 1, 2, next to where I came up, stab it in the pin cushion, and it's as easy and fast as that. So even now, with all the French knots and stuff that I do, I almost always still use a pin cushion underneath. And for those of you that are curious about the colonial knot I mentioned earlier, French knots will always have some variation to it, as you can see, even the two I did, because you have two wraps around the needle in the same direction that are stacked on top of each other. So if it moves or shifts, you'll get like different shaped French knots, no matter how consistent you are. Even, for example, this one right here. These are all just French knots, and you can kind of tell. I have some more oval, some that are more circular. If you are a real stickler for having really consistent knots, you can consider using the colonial knot. And so you're going in one direction and then the other direction. So how I like to hold my thread is I'll still have it on a pin cushion like so. I'll hold this downwards like this. My needle goes on the left side of the thread and underneath. So again, thread is being held down like this, needle's on the left side, it goes underneath, and then with my left hand, I wrap it around like so. And so you have thread going in both directions, and then you just put it back down next to where it came up. Again, this is a little bit loosey-goosey right now. So again, keeping some tension on this thread. Not too much, just a little bit so it's taut, and then you can pull it through and see it's a really nice, almost perfect circle when you do the colonial knot. I'll do one again more at a normal speed. So like so, pull the thread down, under, over, back through, next to where you came up, not the same spot. Let me pull through. There you go. There's your other colonial knot. Really nice circles right there. So I think that's how we're going to end off today's Stitching with Stephanie. I hope you guys learned a little bit of something or got some nice simple tips to make your stitching a little bit easier, especially if there's ever some really cool stencils that you want to transfer onto fabric. Rinse Away Design Sheet is definitely an excellent way to do that. If you've never tried using Razzle, Dazzle, or Eleganza, they're fantastic threads. Using different needles is always really helpful too. So if there's anything you want me to cover, or if you just want me to do more live stitching in addition to the tutorials that are on our Facebook page, I can definitely go through those in more of a, I guess, live setting. So if any of you need me to repeat it or show it more in detail or from a different angle, I can definitely do that too. This is definitely a wide open space, and I really want to cater to what you guys are looking for. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And next time, other people bring your projects too so they can stitch along with you, or just you guys can all stitch from wherever you're joining in from. Yeah, so I don't know if you guys could hear Klista from behind the camera. Would just say next time, make sure you guys bring some of your own projects as well, and we can continue stitching and chatting about different stuff. If you want even interesting facts about birds while I talk about the BOM or show you how to do different stitches, I can do that as well. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Have a great rest of your Friday. If any of you are joining from Paducah or some shows, I hope you enjoy the show. If not, enjoy the spring weather. It's finally coming, especially in Calgary, so I'm so happy. So take care. Calista says bye from behind the camera. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.